On a quiet afternoon in Willow Creek, a blizzard swept in without warning, turning calm skies into chaos. In the heart of that storm, a little disabled girl and her loyal German shepherd stumbled upon a chilling sight. Two men, a veteran and a police officer, bound, gagged, and half buried in the snow, their faces pale and frozen beneath the roaring wind. If help didn't come soon, both would disappear forever beneath the white silence of the storm. Before we dive into this unforgettable story of silent heroes, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Type your country in the comments, and if you believe no soul should ever be left behind, hit subscribe so you never miss the next story. Wishing you a peaceful, good day wherever you are. The afternoon sky over Willow Creek had turned from silver to white, the kind of white that swallowed the horizon. Snow fell relentlessly, coating every roof, fence, and path until the world outside seemed erased. Wind howled through the frozen trees, whistling against the wooden walls of a small house standing alone at the edge of town. Inside that house, a faint warmth flickered from a crackling fire. A little girl named Emily Carter, 5 years old, sat on the living room floor beside a large German shepherd named Rex, building small towers out of wooden blocks while the storm raged on. Emily was small and pale, her blonde hair tousled and her left leg replaced by a thin metallic prosthetic that gleamed faintly under the soft lamplight. Her mother, Grace, a nurse at the town hospital, was working the evening shift, leaving Emily in Rex's watchful care. The old clock on the wall ticked quietly, the house breathing only the sound of wind and the faint pop of firewood. It was peaceful until Rex's ears twitched. Without warning, the dog stood up, stiff and alert, his deep brown eyes fixed on the window, his body tensed as if he had caught a scent beyond the howling snow. Then came the bark, sharp, loud, and urgent. He paced toward the door, growling low in his throat, then turned back, grabbing the sleeve of Emily's sweater gently with his teeth, pulling once, twice, more insistently each time. Emily frowned, confused at first, then saw the desperation in his eyes. Something was wrong out there. She hesitated, glancing toward the window where the wind lashed against the glass. But Rex barked again, loud enough to drown the storm for a moment. Her small hand reached for her crutches. Within minutes, she was wrapped in her thick pink coat, a wool scarf around her neck, gloves pulled tight over her trembling fingers. Rex pawed at the door until Emily turned the knob. A rush of icy air slammed into them, and for a second, she almost retreated, but the dog pushed forward, forcing her to follow. The world outside had vanished under snow. The path from the porch to the gate was nearly gone, buried under white mounds. Each gust of wind bit into Emily's face, her breath forming small clouds in the air. She steadied herself on her crutches, the metal tips sinking slightly into the snow with each careful step. Rex stayed close, occasionally looking back to ensure she was following. They moved through the storm like two lost figures in a white sea. Then, a sound, muffled, weak, almost swallowed by the wind. Rex stopped abruptly, ears perked high, and began barking again, louder this time. Emily's pulse quickened. They were only a few dozen meters from the house when she saw it, two shapes half buried in the snowbank, motionless. Her heart lurched. She limped forward, her crutches sinking deep as Rex charged ahead, barking furiously. When she reached them, her breath caught in her throat. Two men, one wearing a dark cap with the word veteran stitched in white, the other in what looked like a police uniform, were lying almost completely covered in snow, their hands bound behind their backs, mouths sealed with gray duct tape, faces pale and crusted with frost. Only their heads and shoulders remained visible above the frozen ground. For a heartbeat, Emily thought they were dead. But then the man with the cap stirred slightly, a faint twitch beneath the ice. She dropped to her knees beside him, snow seeping into her gloves. His eyes fluttered open, barely focusing. Beneath the frost, she could see a strong jaw and the weariness of someone much older. Jack, though she didn't know his name yet. The other man, younger, with short light hair and a police radio still clipped to his shoulder, lay completely unconscious. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke, her words carried away by the wind. "It's okay. I'll help you." Her small hands reached to peel away the frozen tape from Jack's mouth. It tore away with a sharp sound, and he gasped for air, his breath ragged and shallow. He tried to speak, but only managed a broken sound before his head tilted toward his bound wrists. Emily understood instantly. She looked at Rex, who was already pawing at the snow beside them. Together they began digging, clawing, pushing, scraping away the snow that pinned the men down. The cold burned her hands even through the gloves, but she kept going, gritting her teeth as her crutches fell to one side. As they uncovered the ropes, Rex lunged forward, using his teeth to bite and tug at the thick cords that bound Jack's wrists. It took several tries. The rope was stiff, frozen solid, but the dog didn't stop. With a final jerk, it snapped. Jack's arms came free, trembling as he rubbed at his numb wrists. He didn't speak. He simply nodded once, his breath misting heavily in the air. Then, with effort, he turned toward the police officer and began helping Rex dig again. Emily joined in, shoving snow aside with her small hands. The storm intensified, flakes swirling so thick they could barely see a few feet ahead. Jack's movements were slow and heavy, exhaustion clear in every breath. Finally, they freed the second man. His skin was pale, lips blue, eyes closed. Jack checked his pulse and exhaled, faint but there. The veteran reached for the radio attached to the man's shoulder, pressing the side button with shaking fingers. Static filled the air, then a voice barely audible beneath the storm's howl. Jack spoke into it with what strength he had left, calling for help, giving their location before the device crackled out. Emily sat back panting, her face flushed and wet from melted snow. Rex stood beside her, chest heaving, steam rising faintly from his fur. The world around them was nothing but white, endless, silent, swallowing. Then, far off in the distance, a faint flicker of color pierced the snow, red and blue lights growing brighter, spinning through the storm. The wail of sirens followed soon after, breaking through the wind's relentless roar. Emily hugged Rex tightly as the figures of rescuers appeared through the haze, bundled in heavy coats carrying stretchers. Jack slumped sideways, finally surrendering to exhaustion as two men lifted him onto a stretcher. The officer was taken next. Snow crunched beneath boots, radios crackled, and the air smelled faintly of diesel and frost. Emily stood still, trembling, her prosthetic leg half buried in snow, watching silently as they carried the men toward the ambulance. Before the doors closed, Jack's eyes fluttered open once more. Through the swirl of snow, he caught sight of the little girl, tiny, fragile, standing beside her dog in the storm. For a moment, their eyes met. He didn't know her name, but he knew what she had done. And somewhere inside that frozen stillness, gratitude lit like a spark, faint but warm. The doors shut, and the sound of the siren faded into the white distance. Emily turned to Rex, who wagged his tail weakly, snow clinging to his fur. She crouched to pat his head, whispering softly, "You did good." Together, they stood in silence for a moment longer, as the wind eased and the first golden hint of dusk touched the edge of the storm. Morning light crept slowly through the frosted windows of Willow Creek General Hospital, painting pale streaks across the quiet ward. Machines beeped softly, monitors blinked, and the smell of antiseptic hung in the cold air. Jack Carter stirred on the narrow hospital bed, his right shoulder throbbing dully beneath the thick blanket. His fingers felt stiff, his forearms numb from the night before, as though the storm had followed him inside. When he tried to move, pain cut through his chest like ice. It took a moment for his blurred memory to piece itself together, the blinding snow, the ropes, the little girl's trembling voice, and the flash of red-blue lights before the world went dark. He turned his head weakly toward the next bed. The police officer who had been buried beside him lay wrapped in heavy blankets, a breathing mask covering half his face. The man's name, according to the tag at his bedside, was Officer Daniel Hayes, 38 years old, built broad-shouldered, his hair short and pale brown against the white pillow. A nurse adjusted the IV line near his hand, whispering something about frostbite and exhaustion. For a long moment, Jack simply watched the steady rhythm of the officer's chest, grateful they were both alive. His own breath steamed faintly in the chilly room, as if the hospital itself had not yet escaped the storm. The door opened quietly, and a tall man in a navy parka stepped in, brushing snow from his shoulders. His silver police badge caught the morning light. Sheriff Michael Donnelly, 60 years old, was known throughout Willow Creek as the kind of man who'd seen too much and forgotten little. His thick gray mustache hid a permanent frown line, though his blue eyes held a quiet steadiness that commanded trust. He stopped beside Jack's bed, offering a nod that was part greeting, part gratitude. "You're lucky," he said in a low voice. "Another hour in that snow, and we'd be talking over a body bag." Jack managed a faint smile, his lips dry. "Guess luck finally owed me one," he murmured. Donnelly pulled up a chair. He flipped open a small notebook, its edges damp from snow, and clicked his pen. "Tell me what you remember, son. Everything, from the start." Jack exhaled slowly, closing his eyes as the memories came back sharp and uninvited. He told the sheriff how he had been hiking along the old logging trail 2 nights earlier, when he stumbled upon 2 men trading packages by the tree line, a silver pickup truck idling nearby, headlights off, voices muffled. He had recognized enough military-grade hardware to know it wasn't hunting gear. Before he could back away, something hard struck the side of his head. The rest had been darkness, rope, and cold. When Jack opened his eyes again, the sheriff was watching closely. "And the officer?" Donnelly asked. Jack nodded toward Daniel's bed. "He must have been responding to a call. I remember hearing a siren just before they dragged me deeper into the woods. My guess? He followed the same tire tracks and walked right into their trap." Donnelly scribbled notes, his brow furrowing. "We found both sets of prints. Whoever did this knew exactly where you were. Too clean, too fast. That means someone fed them your location." His voice dropped lower. "Inside information." Jack frowned. "You're saying there's a leak in your own department?" Donnelly didn't answer right away. He clicked the pen shut, pocketed his notebook, and stood. "I'm saying this town's not as quiet as it looks, Mr. Carter." The sheriff's tone softened slightly. "You've done more than enough already. Rest while you can. But if you're willing, I might need your help before this is over." Jack didn't hesitate. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Later that morning, Grace Carter arrived at the hospital with Emily in tow. The girl's small crutches clicked against the tile floor, her pink coat still damp with melted snow. She held Rex's leash tightly, the big German shepherd trotting beside her, tail wagging but eyes alert as ever. When Emily saw Jack sitting up, her face lit with relief. "You're okay?" she said softly, stopping beside his bed. Jack smiled faintly, still weak but clearly moved. "Because of you," he said. Grace stood behind her daughter, her nurse's scrubs half hidden under a heavy coat, her eyes tired from a long shift. For a moment, words seemed unnecessary. She simply placed a hand over Jack's blanket and nodded. Gratitude needed no translation. Sheriff Donnelly reappeared not long after, this time carrying a folder thick with reports. He knelt beside Rex, scratching the dog's neck affectionately before turning to Grace. "Ma'am, I owe your daughter and this fella here a commendation," he said. Grace shook her head modestly. "Emily just followed her heart," she replied. The sheriff's gaze shifted to Rex. "Then I suppose he followed something stronger." He rose, handing the folder to Jack. "If you're up for it, I'd like you to see something." Inside were photographs, tire marks, boot prints, a half-burned map of the forest trail. Donnelly's finger tapped a photo of a muddy clearing. "That's where we found you. There's residue of gasoline, maybe for burning evidence. We also found skid marks from a heavy truck heading east. Could be where they stashed their gear." By late afternoon, Jack stood outside the hospital wrapped in a borrowed coat, watching as Rex sniffed the snow near the ambulance bay. Donnelly and another officer followed a few steps behind. The dog's breath puffed white clouds as he moved, nose low to the ground, tracing invisible patterns only he could read. Suddenly, Rex stopped, tail stiff, and barked once, sharp, sure, commanding. Donnelly knelt beside the mark in the snow. "Gasoline," he muttered, the faint smell still lingering. "Same trace we found at the, site." The sheriff's eyes narrowed toward the road leading out of town. They were moving fast, maybe toward the old freight warehouse off Mill Road. Jack exhaled, his breath merging with the wind. "You think they planned to torch the evidence?" Donnelly nodded grimly. "Or hide something worse?" The sheriff turned to him. "You sure you're fit to come along?" Jack flexed his fingers, still stiff but steady. "I didn't crawl out of that snow to sit this out." For the first time, Donnelly's mustache twitched into a faint, approving smile. "Then welcome to the team, soldier." That evening, as dusk returned to the town, Grace stopped by Jack's room once more before heading home. The hallway lights had dimmed, casting a soft amber glow across the corridor. Emily had fallen asleep on a waiting room bench, Rex curled protectively at her feet. Grace looked at Jack, her voice low. "She hasn't stopped talking about you," she said with a small smile. Jack chuckled weakly. "I think she's the real hero." Grace's eyes softened. "Maybe, but heroes don't always wear badges or uniforms, Mr. Carter. Sometimes they just show up when the world needs them." Jack lowered his gaze, a quiet humility flickering across his face. Outside the window, snow still fell, though softer now, like the storm was finally surrendering. Inside, the room was warm, filled with the hum of machines and the faint rhythm of steady breathing. Jack leaned back against his pillow, exhaustion finally overtaking him. But somewhere beneath the ache of frozen limbs and bruised skin, determination had begun to take root. There were still questions buried under that snow, and he intended to dig them out. Snow was falling again over Willow Creek, thicker and slower this time, the kind that buried streets in silence and turned lights into hazy blurs. A week had passed since the hospital, and the town seemed to have exhaled, yet Jack Carter had not. The cold still clung to him in a way that had nothing to do with weather. That night, the sky hung low and gray, and his breath curled in the air as he walked the narrow road toward the Carter home. In one hand, he held a small paper bag. Inside were two gifts, a polished brass collar tag engraved with the words "Brave Heart," meant for Rex, and a weathered book of fairy tales for Emily. Simple things, but enough to say what words never could. The house stood at the edge of the woods, its windows glowing faintly against the snow. Jack paused for a moment at the gate, the wind brushing against his coat, and listened to the muffled sounds within, soft laughter, the bark of a dog, the hum of domestic peace. He smiled faintly, a warmth spreading through him that even the cold couldn't dim. As he climbed the steps to the porch, he thought of how little he'd had to offer since coming home from war. Gratitude, he decided, was a good place to start. He knocked once, twice, just as a gust of wind swept across the field, rattling the eaves like dry bones. Grace opened the door, her face framed by the pale light behind her. She was in her late 30s, hair dark and tied loosely at the back, the exhaustion of her hospital shifts softened by a quiet grace that matched her name. Her eyes lit up with recognition and surprise. "Jack," she said, her voice low but kind, "you shouldn't be out in this weather." Jack gave a small shrug, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Guess I've had worse," he replied, his tone half teasing, half true. Emily appeared from behind her mother, balancing on her crutches, her blonde hair a little messy, her prosthetic leg gleaming faintly beneath a flannel dress. "Jack," she exclaimed, "Rex heard you coming." The big German shepherd bounded forward, tail wagging, pressing its muzzle against Jack's gloved hand. He knelt down, laughing softly as Rex licked his wrist. "I brought something for you," he said, pulling the small tag from his pocket. The dog tilted its head as Jack clipped the tag to its collar. The word "Brave Heart" caught the light, glinting gold against the black fur. "Fits him, doesn't it?" Jack said. Emily nodded solemnly, as if it were a medal of honor. He reached into the bag again and handed her the book. "For when the storms get too long." She took it with both hands, her smile wide and unguarded. Grace's eyes softened. "You didn't have to," she said quietly, but there was gratitude in her tone. Jack just smiled. "Sometimes it helps to remember there's still good left in the world." Then, without warning, the lights flickered once, twice, and went out. The entire house plunged into darkness. A split. Second later, thunder cracked across the hills, followed by a low mechanical hum outside, the unmistakable sound of an engine idling in the storm. The warmth drained from Grace's face. Jack straightened instantly, instincts kicking in. Rex's posture changed too. The dog's tail went rigid, ears pricked, a growl rumbling from deep in its chest. Lightning flashed across the window pane, revealing faint silhouettes moving beyond the fence. 3, maybe 4 men. "Get her downstairs," Jack whispered sharply. Grace didn't hesitate. She scooped Emily into her arms, the little girl clutching the book tightly, her eyes wide. Rex stood at the doorway, body tense, his growl rising into a snarl. Outside, boots crunched through the snow. The metallic click of a weapon being loaded carried through the wind. Jack shut the front door quietly, sliding the deadbolt into place. In the dark, he moved like a man remembering another life, quick, silent, every motion calculated. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and positioned himself near the window. Grace hurried past with Emily, disappearing down the stairs to the basement, where an old emergency lantern cast a dim glow. The first window shattered with a burst of glass. Jack ducked, rolled across the floor, and reached for the light switch out of habit. Nothing. The power was dead. Another crash followed, then a voice shouting, "Find him! And the girl!" Snow blew in through the broken pane, swirling around the room like smoke. Jack pressed himself against the wall, counting the footsteps outside. Rex crouched beside him, growling low, muscles coiled like a spring. "Easy," Jack murmured under his breath. The door handle turned once, twice, before the entire door shook under the force of a kick. Wood splintered. A boot came through, followed by the shadow of a man. Jack swung the poker hard, connecting with a sharp clang against metal. A rifle barrel knocked aside. The man grunted and stumbled backward. Rex lunged, teeth flashing, and clamped down on the attacker's arm. A scream cut through the wind. Jack seized the chance, shoving the man back through the doorway into the snow. Two more figures emerged from the darkness, their flashlights slicing through the blizzard. Shots rang out, muffled by the storm. Splinters flew from the doorframe as Jack and Rex dove behind the overturned sofa. Jack's breathing came heavy and fast, the taste of cold metal in his mouth. Downstairs, Grace crouched near the basement wall, holding Emily close. Her hands shook as she reached for the old landline phone sitting on the shelf. The line crackled with static. She whispered a quick prayer and dialed the number she knew by heart. Above them, the sound of breaking wood and muffled shouts grew louder. Emily looked up at her mother, her voice trembling. "Mom, is Jack okay?" Grace pressed the receiver to her ear, her voice low but firm. "He will be. He has Rex." Then, relief broke. Through the static, a voice answering. "Sheriff's office, this is Donnelly." Grace exhaled sharply. "This is Grace Carter, men with guns, my house, please hurry. Jack's here." The line cut with a snap of thunder, but it was enough. Upstairs, Jack heard sirens faint in the distance, buried under the storm but growing nearer. He peered over the sofa, counting shadows moving past the window. "We're out of time," he whispered. He gestured toward the back of the house, signaling Rex. The dog crept low, slipping silently toward the kitchen. The back door burst open, snow sweeping in like a wave. Jack swung again, catching another attacker across the ribs, sending him sprawling into the counter. Rex lunged a second time, driving the man backward into the open door. They tumbled outside, vanishing briefly into the white swirl. Jack grabbed the fallen rifle, checking the safety out of old habit, and aimed toward the last moving shape at the porch. But before he could fire, red and blue lights exploded through the storm. The wail of sirens tore through the storm, sharp and defiant against the howl of the wind. Red and blue lights flared across the snowy field, slicing through the darkness like the heartbeat of the night itself. The small house on the edge of Willow Creek stood half buried in snow and smoke, its windows shattered, its walls glowing faintly with the reflection of emergency lights. Sheriff Michael Donnelly stepped out of his patrol truck, the door slamming shut behind him, his heavy boots sinking into the snow. "Positions!" he barked, voice carrying over the roar of the storm. His team of special officers moved swiftly, spreading into formation, dark figures under the swirling white, their rifles gleaming under the strobe of rotating lights. Inside the house, Jack Carter crouched behind the broken sofa, breathing hard, his shoulders slick with blood that had begun to seep through his sleeve. Rex stood beside him, chest heaving, snow clinging to his fur. The firefight had lasted less than 5 minutes, but felt like hours, flashes of muzzle light, the smell of gunpowder and cold wood splinters in the air. Jack's ears rang faintly from the last burst of gunfire. He peered toward the front door through the haze, spotting one of the intruders crawling toward his weapon. Without hesitation, Jack kicked it aside and pressed the man down with his boot. "It's over," he growled, voice hoarse. The man spat blood into the snow, glaring up at him with eyes full of hatred. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he hissed. Jack tightened his grip on the rifle. "I've heard that before," he muttered, his tone colder than the storm outside. The front windows exploded inward as Donnelly's team stormed the entryway. "Police! Drop your weapons!" shouted one of the officers. The remaining gunmen turned in panic. Too late. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness again, brief and bright, and within moments the house fell silent, except for the sound of boots on shattered glass. Rex growled low, standing guard over Emily and Grace, who were crouched behind the kitchen counter. His left ear was torn, blood streaking through the tan fur, but his stance never wavered. When the door burst open, he lunged instinctively, positioning himself between the approaching officers and the small, trembling girl behind him. "Easy, boy," Jack said softly, lowering his weapon and resting a bloodied hand on Rex's neck. The dog's growl faded slowly, replaced by a low whimper of exhaustion. Sheriff Donnelly stepped into the room, his breath visible in the cold air. "Clear the perimeter," he ordered, scanning the scene with quick, practiced eyes. 3 men lay restrained on the floor, their hands zip-tied behind their backs. The fourth, older, broader, and wearing a dark tactical jacket, was dragged into the light by 2 officers. When the man lifted his face, Donnelly froze for half a second. Beneath the dirt and bruises, he recognized him. Lieutenant Mark Reynolds, one of his own, a decade on the force, loyal, trusted, until tonight. "Mike, it's not what you think," Reynolds rasped, his breath misting. The sheriff's expression hardened. "Save it." His voice carried the weight of betrayal, quiet but unyielding. He nodded to the officers. "Take him out." As they pulled Reynolds toward the door, Jack leaned against the wall, his chest rising and falling, the realization settling in. "Your own man?" he asked quietly. Donnelly's jaw tightened. "He was the leak," he said simply. "Fed them your location, sold out a badge for a truck full of weapons." His gaze dropped briefly to the floor before lifting again, calm but weary. "And nearly got a child killed." Grace rushed to Emily, kneeling to embrace her tightly. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling between relief and disbelief. Emily clung to her mother's neck, small shoulders shaking. Rex sat beside them, panting heavily, one paw leaving faint red prints in the snow that had drifted through the open door. When Emily turned, she reached for him, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck. "He's not just a dog," she said softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "He's family." Jack, still leaning near the wall, smiled weakly through his exhaustion. He pressed a hand to his wounded shoulder, feeling the dull sting where the bullet had grazed him. Donnelly noticed and gestured toward one of the medics. "Patch him up," the sheriff said. As the medic worked, Donnelly looked around the ruined house, the shattered glass, the overturned furniture, the lingering smell of smoke and fear. "You saved them, Carter," he said, his tone firm but filled with respect. Jack shook his head slowly. "We all did," he murmured. "Even the dog." The sheriff's lips curved in a faint smile. "Especially the dog." Outside, the storm had begun to break. The flashing lights painted streaks of color across the snow, and for the first time all night, the wind softened. Officers led the captured men toward the waiting trucks. One of them cursed under his breath, but Donnelly ignored him. He stepped onto the porch, pulling his coat tighter, and looked back at the small group inside. Grace still holding her daughter close, Rex resting beside them, and Jack standing just behind, silent, battered, but unbroken. The sheriff exhaled, voice low, as if speaking to himself. "It's never the badge that makes the hero. It's the courage to stand in the storm." A quiet settled over the scene, the kind that comes only after chaos, fragile, uncertain, but real. The officers began clearing the area, their radios crackling with updates. Grace guided Emily toward the living room, wrapping a blanket around her small shoulders. Rex lay at her feet, head resting against her knee, his eyes half closed. Jack sat nearby, bandaged and pale, watching the snow drift lazily through the broken doorway. For the first time in a long while, he let himself breathe. The storm outside was dying, its fury replaced by a strange stillness. The house was broken, but those inside it were alive, bound not by blood or duty, but by something far stronger, the simple act of choosing to protect one another. As the lights dimmed and the sirens faded into the distance, Willow Creek seemed to exhale once more. letting the snow fall quietly over a night that would be remembered not for fear, but for the courage that survived it. Spring came late to Willow Creek that year, but when it finally arrived, it came gently, like a promise kept. The snow melted slowly from the rooftops, dripping into quiet puddles that mirrored the pale blue sky. Where the storm had once howled, grass now pushed through the thawing earth. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, the kind of smell that carried renewal. For months, the townspeople had rebuilt what winter had broken, though what they remembered most wasn't the damage. It was the night a little girl, a soldier, and a German shepherd had stood together against fear itself. The morning of the ceremony was mild, with sunlight filtering through the clouds in soft bands. The community hall stood at the center of town, its front steps decorated with a modest banner that read, "Thank you, Jack and Rex," in hand-painted letters. There were no reporters, no flashing cameras, just neighbors, friends, and a quiet sense of gratitude. Folding chairs lined the front lawn, and a few children chased each other around the flagpole, their laughter bright against the breeze. Sheriff Michael Donnelly stood near the podium, adjusting the microphone with the same careful patience he brought to everything. His uniform was crisp, though his expression carried the familiar weariness of a man who'd seen enough storms for one lifetime. Jack Carter arrived without fanfare, wearing his usual olive field jacket, his dog tags tucked beneath the collar. The faint scar on his shoulder still ached when the wind shifted, but he moved easily, with the calm steadiness of someone who'd made peace with his past. Beside him, Rex trotted proudly, his coat gleaming under the sunlight, the small tear on his left ear healed into a pale streak of memory. When they stepped into the crowd, people rose to their feet, not in applause, but in silent acknowledgement. Some smiled, others simply nodded. Jack gave a small, almost embarrassed nod in return, his hand brushing lightly over Rex's head as if to say, "This one's the real hero." Grace stood near the front row, dressed simply, her dark hair tied back, eyes shining with quiet pride. And beside her, leaning lightly on her crutches, was Emily Carter, her face lit with excitement. Her prosthetic leg gleamed silver under the morning sun, a reminder not of loss, but of resilience. She clutched something in her hand, small, round, and shimmering faintly with red ribbon. When Donnelly called her name, she took a deep breath and made her way up the steps, each movement steady and deliberate. The murmurs of the crowd faded into silence. Emily reached the podium, glancing down at Rex, who wagged his tail as if he understood every word that was about to be spoken. The little girl lifted the handmade medal, a small circle of tin, polished to shine, tied with a bright red ribbon. The words, "Heart of Courage," were etched unevenly across the surface in careful handwriting. Her voice when she spoke was soft but unwavering. "This is for Rex," she said, "for saving my mom, for helping Mr. Jack, and for teaching me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going anyway." The crowd held its breath. Grace's hands covered her mouth, eyes wet. Even Donnelly's usually stern face softened. Emily leaned down and placed the medal gently around Rex's neck. The dog stood perfectly still, head tilted, tail swaying slowly, as though he understood the weight of the moment. Then the audience began to clap, not thunderous applause, but something better, warm, genuine, deeply human. Jack knelt beside Rex, smiling faintly, his eyes reflecting a sheen he didn't bother to hide. For a brief instant, all the pain, fear, and cold of that long winter seemed to fade, leaving only peace. Later, after the ceremony, the townspeople gathered around tables set with pies, coffee, and laughter. Jack stood quietly near the edge of the crowd, sipping from a paper cup, watching as Emily played fetch with Rex across the grass. Grace joined him, folding her arms gently against the breeze. "You never did like being the center of attention," she said softly. Jack smiled. "I've had enough noise in my life," he replied. His gaze lingered on Emily and Rex. "Besides, looks like the stars of the show are doing fine without me." Grace followed his eyes, a tender smile tugging at her lips. "They make a good team," she said. "You all do." Weeks passed, and the story of that night slowly turned into something quieter, something that lived in the hearts of the townsfolk more than in their words. Grace opened her new venture, a therapy center for disabled children built in an old refurbished barn at the edge of Willow Creek. Sunlight streamed through its wide doors, falling across mats, toys, and the gentle presence of animals, rabbits, small horses, and of course, Rex. He became the program's special trainer, patient and calm, teaching children to balance, to trust, and to smile again. Emily helped too, guiding the younger ones, her crutches clicking across the wooden floor like a steady rhythm of hope. Jack visited often, though he never said much about it. Officially, he joined the sheriff's department as a survival instructor, teaching young officers how to handle themselves in the wild, how to read tracks, how to listen to silence. Unofficially, he had become something of a guardian for the town, checking in on families after storms, repairing fences, clearing roads when heavy rain hit. People started calling him the quiet hero of Willow Creek, though he always waved it off with a small grin and a shake of his head. "I'm just the guy with the dog," he'd say, and Rex would bark as if agreeing. By early summer, Willow Creek had returned to its gentle rhythm. The scars left by the storm, broken windows, damaged barns, frightened hearts, had all begun to heal. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Jack walked down the dirt road that led toward the Carter home. Emily rode on Rex's back, her laughter echoing down the valley, while Grace followed close behind, her eyes bright with quiet contentment. The air was golden, filled with the hum of crickets and the soft rustle of new leaves. They walked together toward the bridge that overlooked the stream. The last patches of snow glistened like silver under the dying light, and the water below shimmered in gold. Jack stopped for a moment, resting his hands in his jacket pockets. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" he asked softly. Grace looked at him, her smile calm. "All the time," she said. "But then I look at her, and at you, and I realize maybe this was how it was supposed to be." Rex barked once, as if seconding her words, and Emily giggled. "Come on, Jack, the sun's waiting." He chuckled, stepping forward again. The three of them, man, child, and dog, walked on as the last light of day stretched long across the fields. The sky above blazed in hues of amber and rose, the kind of sunset that carried both endings and beginnings. And as the first stars appeared in the soft dusk, the story of Willow Creek closed, not with noise, but with quiet. The quiet of peace hard-earned, of hearts mended, of heroes who asked for nothing but a little light to walk in. In the end, the story of Willow Creek reminds us that real heroes are not those who seek glory, but those who act with quiet kindness when no one is watching. Jack, Grace, Emily, and Rex showed that compassion and courage can shine even in the darkest storm, and that sometimes the smallest act of love can save a life. What about you? What does kindness mean to you in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story touched your heart, remember to subscribe for more stories of hope and humanity. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, strength, and compassion.